So our speaker is Ron Martinson today. And Ron has told me that he describes himself as an answer to recycling because he came to Washington in 1969. He worked on the Hill for 12 years, the Hill, Capitol Hill, right? Then he moved to the executive branch, which is still around, D.C., for 15 years and retired. And then he was called back to Capitol Hill in 2003 for a second stint, after which he retired in 2007. And of course, he's still busy in many ways. And he's certainly, you'll often see him here at the National Presbyterian Church, holding forth on his piano in our various festivities, and we're very grateful for his service to us. But he says this career has been kind of like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride at Disneyland. And we hope we can gain some insights into how a bill becomes law through understanding what Ron has been doing. So let me give you an idea of Ron's positions, official positions. He was legislative assistant to Congressman John Blatnick of Minnesota, administrative assistant to Congressman Bob Price of Texas, administrative assistant to the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. Then, in his return to the Hill, staff director of the Subcommittee on the Civil Service and Agency Organization, which was part of the Committee on Government Reform of the U.S. House of Representatives. And he was a special assistant to the Archivist of the United States, special assistant to the Associate Administrator of the U.S. General Services Administration, and member of the staff for a while, Director of Congressional Affairs for the Commission on the Bicentennial of the United States Constitution. So that shall give you a good idea of the cross-section of Ron's experience. And so without further ado, let's bring on Ron Martinson.
Well, Paul, you've already covered everything that I was going to say, so. But thank you very much. And the first thing I told Paul was, boy, you must be really scraping the bottom of the barrel if you're asking me to be a speaker at the Restaurant Club. But I was happy to get the invite, and it's been a fun exercise for me because I've been sort of rummaging through things in closets and boxes and that, and quite frankly, I didn't realize I'd accumulated so much junk. But in any event, I know some of you already looked at it, but I just sort of picked and chose some things that are, I guess, what I'd call memorabilia of the different things that I've done. And I have to be sure that I wasn't going to get beaten up when I went home. So Wanda is here today, and I'm happy to see her and give her some equal time. There's a few things that are here from the Supreme Court. And I have to say that Wanda is very special to me in so many ways, but particularly she broadened my experience. Because I had worked on Capitol Hill, and I worked in the executive branch, but remember there are 3 branches of the federal government, and she got that covered in spades because for 25 years she was the personal secretary to Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. And then when she left there, she went down to the Justice Department in some senior positions. And then she went back up to the judiciary, and that's where she worked as the executive assistant to the director of the administrative office of the U.S. courts. And then she joined me in retirement. The only difference between Wanda and me is I call myself, and Paul alluded to this, a retiree retread, because I was retired, happily retired, by the way, and my friend Tom Davis, who was our neighbor for many years, our kids grew up together. He was elected as chairman of the House Government Reform Committee in 2003, and his birthday is January 5. And another friend and I were taking him out for his birthday. We do it every so often. We call it Boys Night Out. So we were at the restaurant. We each had a beer, and Tom walked in. It was the day that the Republican conference was going to formally approve the leadership people. So we knew it was going to happen. It was just a technicality. So he came and he sat between us, and we had our beers and we raised them up and said, well, congratulations, Mr. Chairman. To which he pointed his finger with no smiles. He said, Ron, You're going to be staff director of the Civil Service and Agency Organization Subcommittee. And Paul, I'm getting you detailed to the committee. I need your help on procurement. And Paul and I looked at each other. Did his lips just move? How much beer have we had here, you know? But it's what happened. And so anyway, Paul was right. I went back to the Hill. Okay, well, let's see what we can talk about here. First of all, I'm reminded of the famous Groucho Marx quote. He said, when you're going to do a talk, think of it as a lady's skirt. You want it long enough to cover the subject, but short enough to keep it interesting. So, we'll see if we meet that. A little bit about me personally. I was born and raised in Eveleth, Minnesota, which is the home of the world's largest iron ore mines. It's called the Mesabi Range. And we have a claim to fame up there. We say, we're from the land of 11 months of winter and 1 month of bad weather. We actually have another claim, which is that on Main Street, we have the world's largest hockey stick. It's like 50 feet tall. It's a real thing. I don't know, it's made out of plywood or whatever. But in any event, we actually have a bigger claim to fame. And that is that Eveleth is the birthplace of the game of hockey in the United States. And you might say, you're kidding. Well, the National Hockey Hall of Fame Museum is built in my hometown. So it was a small town, and my personal life was kind of uneventful growing up as a kid. Nothing special, living in the Lake Country. But then everything changed when I became a teenager. I don't usually discuss this, but I think it probably provides some context. When I was age 16, my mom died. When I was 17, my only brother died. They both had cancer, and they were dying at the same time. Between their deaths, my father was hit by an uninsured motorist. My brother went bankrupt. He took my dad with him. We lost our home. And all of that sort of reminds me of the famous line, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like to play?
Yeah.
So, they say that there are no atheists in foxholes during the war. And my brother came to Christ when he was seriously ill. And while attending church with him, I came to the Lord when I was 14. I went on to be the first person in my family that ever graduated from high school. And then I went on to the University of Minnesota, and I became the first person in my family to get a bachelor's degree in history, American history, and then a master's degree. I taught for 1 year at Elgin Community College just outside of Chicago. I had a great time doing that. And I had been offered a scholarship and teaching assistantship to go back to the university to work on a PhD. But then along came this amazing opportunity of a lifetime to come to Washington and work for my congressman. This is sort of a fairy tale dream come true because, let's face it, if I'm going to study American history, where am I going to learn more history? In a history book at the University of Minnesota or working in the place where they make the history? That was kind of a no-brainer. So I came to Washington to work for my congressman, John Blatnick, and I have to tell you, northern Minnesota is extremely, the word extremely liberal. And people think about liberal conservative today. You have no idea what I'm talking about when I say extremely liberal. I'll give you the context. You ever hear of Gus Hall? He was the chairman of the Communist Party USA, and he was born 20 miles from my home. And he was a typical person. Anyway, it's ironic because my congressman, John Blatnick, was a prominent Democrat, but we never really discussed politics. Before he became a congressman, believe it or not, he was a school teacher. And he wanted to know my grades in school. That was the most important thing to him. I guess it must have worked out. I love this man, and I'll tell you, he was a real trailblazer. And you probably say, well, who's this guy? It doesn't affect me in any way. He held the first hearings in the Congress on the dangers of cigarette smoking. You can imagine how popular that made him with the Southern congressmen who were representing the tobacco states. He co-authored the largest public works project in the history of the United States, the Federal Interstate Highway Program. And if you think, well, that's neat, I drive on the highway, but he affected you even more than that. Because when you drive down the highway and you look at those big signs, you know, turn here, there were 20 miles to Pittsburgh or whatever, he was the guy, the staff came into his office as they were drafting the legislation. They said, one of the things we have to decide, Mr. Chairman, is what color are those signs going to be? He is the one they decided that they would be green. So when you look at those signs, you think of John Blatnick. Also, because of the large iron ore mines, there was a problem with water pollution, and they would filter the mine ore and stuff like that, and all this residue, and they would sort of, where do we dump it type of thing. And a lot of the people in northern Minnesota were worried about the pristine quality of the lakes. So John Blatnick authored legislation to create the Federal Water Pollution Control Agency, which became EPA. And that affects you every day. So, when I came to Washington, I expected to stay a year and then go back to Minnesota to teach. That was 49 years ago. So, okay, enough about me and kind of getting here. What about the Congress? Some initial thoughts. Well, most people, and hopefully all of you, know that there are 3 branches of the United States government, and Article 1 is the Congress. The framers realized that the object of the Congress was the people. So you have a Senate with 100 senators and House with 435 representatives. From its beginning, the Congress has been revered and ridiculed. For example, humorist Will Rogers once said, 2 things you never want to see being made are sausages and laws. And what is the opposite of progress? Congress. Or Winston Churchill said it well, Americans always do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. So what are the duties of Congress? Well, the main job, obviously, is to enact legislation provided by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. A lot of people think Congress can just pass laws. No, 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 no. Article 1, Section 8 says you may pass laws that do these things. And all things not given to you are retained by the states. Remember, the Constitution was created by the states, and they ceded to the federal government certain powers. Now it's the tail wagging the dog. The Congress, like everybody in the country, wants the Congress to fix this, do that, you know, and be your babysitter and everything else. That's not what it was supposed to do, but it's sort of becoming that way. But in any event, the second thing that Congress is supposed to do is to provide oversight of the expenditure of appropriated money. And by the way, this is no surprise, they don't do that very well. There's vast duplication and waste throughout the government. I'll give you an example. When I was staff director of the subcommittee, we got into the discussion about agency organization, how much duplication there is in departments. There are 15 programs spread throughout all these departments and agencies do this, that, and the other thing. Pizza. You go to the grocery store and you pick up a box of frozen pizza. Well, what happens is there's an assembly line going down like this, and the pizzas are going down here. So everything has to be inspected, the Food and Drug Administration, for your safety. And so what happens is the pizza comes down the thing, and somebody puts tomato sauce or tomatoes or whatever on it. That has to be inspected by the Food and Drug Administration. But if the pizza keeps going, and somebody sprinkles some hamburger or sausage on it, that has to be inspected by the Department of Agriculture. Did you know that? Your tax dollars are at work. Wynne Skiles, who was a friend of mine, was the administrative assistant or chief of staff to Senator John Tower. And you have to think about the election cycle. And these members of Congress, they want to be sure that they're pleasing the public. You know, congressmen and senators are not exactly risk takers sometimes. It doesn't pay. That's the reason why Wynne said to me, here's how it works in John Tower's office. It's a 6-year term, right? The first 2 years, Senator Tower is a statesman. The second 2 years, he's a senator. The third 2 years, he's a demagogue. So, what goes on in the congressional offices? Well, in a typical, whether it's a senator or a House member, you have a staff of people that take care of that business. You have a chief of staff, you have legislative assistants, you have a press person, you have just your lower level staff to kind of pick up this stuff and do whatever filing. And then you also have a caseworker. Who was a caseworker? Congressman gets a phone call. My husband dropped dead and he was a veteran. I don't know who to call. Or my Social Security check didn't come in last month. Congressman, find my Social Security check. So you get all these personal problems that people have. I remember when Dave Durnberger was first elected to the Senate. He was elected because Hubert Humphrey had died, my home state of Minnesota. And when Dave was elected, he became senator that day because he was filling an unfilled portion of the remainder of the sentence. I
guess that was subconscious, wasn't it?
The term. But in any event, he showed up in the office with a guy who'd been his press secretary on the campaign. Just the two of them. And they're like, no, this is my office, huh? And the phone rang. It was a Veterans Day holiday. Nobody was around. I was the only one that came in just as a courtesy. It was from my home state. I was there, wanted to give him a personal welcome. The phone rang, and this staff guy, he wasn't even on the payroll. He answers the phone, and turns out here's a lady calling in panic. Her husband was over in Greece. I don't know if he was on business or whatever. He died, and the local undertaker did the embalming or whatever, and would not let the body go until he was paid, and he was basically extorting the family. So she's panicking. And this poor guy's listening to this, so I get on the phone and I listen to the lady, and I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, let me get your information, and I will have somebody get back to you. So when the phone hung up, I turned to Dave and this guy, and I said, I happen to know one of the best caseworkers on Capitol Hill. And I called her at home. And I said, can you help this lady? And here's her phone number, blah, blah, blah. She said, I'll get on it. Well, within 24 hours, the body was on the plane coming home. She called the State Department. There's a special phone number that they had that was just for people like her, and boom, 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 boom. And before you know it, the problem is solved. So that's something that goes on in a congressional office, and a lot of people, of course, have no idea until it's your turn and you want or need something that affects or involves the federal government. Remember that. He's not going to take out your laundry or something like that, but if it's something involving Uncle Sam, they try their best to help. So that's what goes on in members' offices. Then, of course, you have the committees. That's where the legislation is actually written. And so all the stuff that we think about in terms of laws, that's where the professional staff, these are the real experts on agricultural issues or transportation or banking or foreign aid or whatever it is. Those are the professional staff, and each member is a member of one or more of these committees. Then there are what I call the institutional offices. In the Senate, you have the Sergeant at Arms, of which I was the administrative assistant to that office, and the secretary who keeps the official records of the Senate. Anything with the embossed seal and the congressional record and all that stuff. He does all that. And then in the House, you have the clerk. You have the Sergeant at Arms. You remember this, when you see the President doing a State of the Union, and everybody marches in, Mr. Speaker, the President, that's the doorkeeper saying that. Then in addition to that, you also have a Chief Administrative Officer. He's the nuts and bolts guy on the House side that does what the Sergeant at Arms office does on the Senate side. And then there's one other elected officer, and that is the chaplain. And I'll get to that a little later. Anyway, then there are the ancillary support offices to the Congress. There's the architect of the Capitol, who takes care of the building and all the grounds and the office buildings. And he's the person that works with the Senate and the House. There is the Government Accountability Office, used to be called the General Accounting Office, GAO. And I have some interesting connection to that because I used to meet regularly with the Comptroller General of the United States, the head of the GAO. And one time he came to my office and he was, I guess, musing about wanting to do something about the name because people were like, what is the General Accounting Office? What does that mean? And he said, you know, we need to change the name to something that makes sense or it resonates. And we kind of went back and forth, and he came up with the idea of the Government Accountability Office. The word accountability means somebody's looking over your shoulder to be sure you're spending the money the way you're supposed to do. It kind of made sense. I said, that's a long accountability. Maybe we could come up with another word, but I never did. And so that's what we wound up with, and I was there when we changed the name to what it is today. The most important thing was GAO was the brand. Everybody knew what GAO. If GAO is coming after your agency, boy, you better hide, because they're the people that come in and snoop, and they look at your records. And if Congress has passed money, an appropriation for you to do a certain project or program, and that GAO is sent in by the committee, like, why did they spend money on X? Or why did they spend $500 million on this computer system that doesn't work? That's common. And so, anyway, that's what the GAO does. And then what happens is they come back, and they've sweated, and they have worked so hard, they put together a great report. They call them blue books. They send them to the appropriate people on Capitol Hill, like, look at what we found that you can fix and save money. They all look at it, and nothing happens. 50 years later, 100 years later, same programs, same activities, nothing happens. Then, of course, there's the Library of Congress. If you've never been there, you need to go. It is staggeringly beautiful and overwhelming in terms of what it owns in its collection. It started off, when our country was created, with 6,487 books. Today it has 16 million. And it has everything that's copyrighted. That means movies. That means newspapers. That means documentaries. I mean, anything that sort of falls in that category, you want to protect it. You be sure the Library of Congress gets at least a copy of it. And it even has, believe it or not, one of the original copies of the Gutenberg Bible, the first book ever printed on a movable printing press in 1453. And speaking of printing, another agency of the legislative branch is the Government Printing Office. That has changed obviously now with all the high-tech stuff, but the Government Printing Office is where you used to go, and I presume sort of still go, for anything that's going to be printed that has the stamp of the United States government on it. So they do the Congressional Record, they do the Federal Register. If you get a booklet on your Social Security benefits, how they've changed this year, the government GPO is supposed to do the printing of that. So that's another office. Look there. All right, well, that's kind of an overview of Congress and who they are and what they do. Now, what about bringing it a little closer to home? So where do I fit in during all of this time? Well, Paul's pretty much covered, I guess, the 50,000-foot view, maybe just add a little bit to it. I wound up, well, I first came to work for Congressman Blatnick, but what happens, like I'm sure it does in any occupation or any place that anybody is that you start to meet people, you start to network, you find things that are of interest to you, and before you know it, new opportunities come along, and you go into a different job, or you get a better job and with more responsibilities. And so that's kind of what I did during my years on the Hill, again, what Paul already sort of covered. And then I went down to the executive branch when President Reagan was elected, and for 4 years I was the special assistant to the Archivist of the United States. That was an amazing experience. I remember when I first got there, because I was working for the Archivist, I had staff people say, well, would you like to see some of our treasures? I'm like, no, I'd love to see some treasures. So they brought me in this room with an old table, well, like this one. And they brought me into the room with an old table, and there was this thing that looked like an old photo album. It was brown leather and that, and it was like, ooh, what was that? And they said, no, go ahead, you can open it. I can touch that. What is it? They said, go open it. So I opened it up, and I was holding my hand, and I was looking at the Louisiana Purchase Treaty signed by Napoleon Bonaparte with his wax seal. That's the kind of stuff they have there. So that was an amazing experience. And then from there, I went to the Commission on the Bicentennial of the United States Constitution. And I was there for just about 4 years. And that in itself was an amazing experience. And for the first and the only time since the Constitution has been on display at the National Archives, they actually opened up the sealed cases, took the documents out and photographed them, made a limited number of full-scale replicas, and then gave them to governors and gave them to leaders of industry that were, supporting the bicentennial. Everybody was supposed to support the bicentennial because it's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, business, economics, everything is what makes our country what it is. And so everybody was very happy to support the bicentennial. And that's where I accumulated in just some memorabilia and just some amazing memories of what a marvelous thing that was. Then anyway, I sort of going back to wrapping that up to 15 years, then I retired. I was very happy to be retired for 6 years. Our kids were at the point in grade school, high school, where it was nice that Daddy was at home. Mommy was obviously working at the court. And then after they both graduated from high school, the timing was amazing because, again, Tom Davis came along and dragged me out of retirement to go back to the Hill in that capacity at the subcommittee. So I had time in both eras of Congress. I think this is really an important thing that I will share with you that maybe a lot of people wouldn't or couldn't, and that is people might not realize what a watershed event that was.
Watergate.
And the reason I say that is before that, the Congress was genteel in a sort of a broad sense. Republicans and Democrats truly got along. It was one big family. Yes, they fought over legislation and a bill, whatever. At the end of the day, they all go out and have dinner together, they party together, they socialize together. And because in those days, members of Congress didn't go home every week. You got one paid trip a month as a member of Congress. That's it. And the rest of the time you're here. So what are you doing while you're here? Well, you're making friends, you're influencing people, and on. Then along comes Watergate. And the Watergate babies, this massive change in the Congress. These people were not interested in getting along. They wanted to push the chairman out of the way. I'm here, I was elected, I'm going to talk, I'm going to be important, blah, blah, blah. And the staff of the House doubled. I'll give you an example. Bob Price was on the Science and Astronautics Committee. 15 people staff total. And when they do the Christmas party, because he was a member of that committee, when they do the Christmas party, they want Ron to come and play the piano. I would play the piano, all of them would be standing around me, everybody having a drink and singing the Christmas carols and having a good time. Fast forward several years later, a very senior member of Congress was retiring, and so I was asked if I would play the music for that, and I said, sure, I'll do it. And so they held it in the Science and Astronautics Committee room, and I'm playing the piano, and I thought I was in the Ritz National Bank or at Nordstrom's, because everybody we're like, what's going on here? Where's the party atmosphere? Where's everybody laughing, having a good time? So I agreed to do this with one condition, because Juan and I were driving together then, and I said I would do it providing somebody gives me a ride home, because I ain't walking from Capitol Hill to my house. Oh yeah, sure, no problem. So a guy from the committee staff agreed to take me home. So while we were in the car, I said to him, I just can't get over the difference in the atmosphere. He said, well, I can explain that to you in a minute. He said, when Bob Price was here, we had 15 people on our staff. We now have 45. And we don't know each other. So when we have a party, we try to use the time to get acquainted with each other. So where's the camaraderie? Where's the team spirit? How can you have a team when you don't even know the members of your team? Now multiply that times the entire Congress and you get the idea of what I'm talking about. And the old days, they used to have in-person voting in the House. You had to come, and there was 435, Mr. Smith, aye, Mr. Jones, aye, hey, whatever. And they had to stand there until all the votes were counted. Now it's electronic voting. They come in, what are we voting on? Yes, and they're gone. And when Manuel Lujan of New Mexico was retiring, we were sitting in the Longwood cafeteria, and I said, Manny, I said, out of curiosity, what is your greatest disappointment in serving in the Congress? And he said, the electronic voting. I said, why is that? He said, because I used to know all the members. And once they did that, you lost that. There was not that give and take on the floor. You didn't get a chance to go up to somebody and say, I was thinking about your bill, I want to talk to you about it. It didn't happen anymore. Plus, the staffs are so big, and the committees keep expanding their jurisdiction, so these senators and House members run from one place to another. Well, where am I supposed to be at 10:15 today? Here, Senator, here's your speech. Okay, let's see, I'm good, blah, blah, blah. Where's the next place? That's the way they make laws today. Why do you think Nancy Pelosi said we had to pass the bill before we knew what was in it? It happens all the time. And that's why Congress is dysfunctional in many respects, and that's why our country is in the shape that it's in, because nobody is paying attention because they don't have time to pay attention. They spend half to two-thirds of their time raising money for re-election. So it's the reality of the world we live in. And as I said, I saw both sides of Congress. But I have to tell you, it doesn't have to be that way, because Tom Davis was the kind of a guy that he did practice the traditional politics. He got through his committee the first postal reform bill. They had been trying. You realize how many businesses run on a 1970 business model? That's what the post office was doing. They had tried postal reform legislation time after time after time after time. Nobody ever got anything done. Tom Davis was chairman. That post office was part of the jurisdiction of his committee. He worked the crowd. And when he got done, do you know what the vote was on his bill to reform the committee? 67-0. He got every Republican and every Democrat. So how did he do that? He did that the way they used to do it. You make deals, you try to accommodate, and he would say to me, all these people are here to represent their constituents. I'm going to do what I can to help them. You ever heard of such a novel, crazy idea as that? He said, as long as it doesn't directly conflict with what I'm trying to do, if I can reach them in there and include them and attack on something that will help them, I'm going to do that. So when you see pre- and post-Watergate, there are dramatic differences. But I can tell you that when I became the staff director of the subcommittee, the first thing I did was I invited the Democratic staff, because the Republicans were in the majority, I invited them over to my office, and we had coffee and we had tea, and I'm asking them about their families and where they came from and stuff like that. And there was a young guy by the name of Chris Liu, who was Democratic staff, and when the visit was over, he's going like this. And I'm like, are you okay? He said, well, he said, this is the first meeting I've ever been in where at the end of the meeting with the Republicans that we're not all screaming at each other. And I'm like, whoa. And I said to him, welcome to my world. This is the way we're going to conduct business. And I tried my best to do that, and I think it's fair to say that we must have been doing okay, because on Friday afternoon I found the original house piano that I used to play many, many years before, and there's some pictures here. It was up in the attic of the Longwood building. The guy from the architect's office was in charge of all the property, and he went and found it. We had to blow the dust off with it. I had it wheeled down, and it sat in my office for all 4 years I was the staff director, and every Friday afternoon we had happy hour. And it was open to everybody. And I had musician friends, and we'd come in there, and I'm telling you, it was the kind of place you'd like to be. And I love to see the smiles, and love to see people talking to each other and laughing. So yes, it can be done. I've seen it, and in a small way, I've tried to make it my way to do business. Talking about the Hill, so far it's been mostly sort of serious stuff, But the Hill has is a place where there's a lot of humor. And sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it's just the members of the staff kind of goof up a little bit. Here's just a few little things. Gene Taylor was a congressman from Starcoxie, Missouri. He was a country boy and he owned a Ford dealership. But he knew how to keep in touch with the folks back home. And they didn't like change. So anyway, the metric conversion bill came up before the floor of the House, and Gene voted against it. And as he was walking back to his office, a smart aleck reporter came up to him and said, "Gene, why did you vote against the metric conversion bill?" And Gene looked at him and he said, "Because I found out they were trying to change the length of an inch." And then there was the time when Gene's press secretary and I were having lunch. And they had this constituent, this old codger guy. He'd call up and he'd give you a piece of his mind. Now, Gene ought to be voting for this, or I don't like what he's doing, blah, blah, blah. So one day the guy called up and he talked to Steve. And he said, "You know," he said, "I'm really mad about Gene, about blah, blah, blah," whatever it was. And he said, he said, hold on. That is not having anything to do with Gene. It's over in the Senate they're doing that. You need to call Senator Eagleton's office. Okay, click. And about 15 minutes later, he calls back. And he's talking to Steve again. And he says, "You know what?" He said, "I just want you to know I called Eagleton's office. And I got him on the phone. And I told him, you know, the blah, 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 blah." And he tried to argue with me. And I said, "You know what? McGovern is right. You are a crazy SOB." And he said, I hung up on him. And then there was Senator William Scott of Virginia, who loved to take junkets. He was the premier junket, not that there aren't lots of other ones. But one time he went down to the Panama Canal, and I think within a year he made a second trip. You know, whoever was going someplace, Scott was on the plane. And so when he got back, the reporter said to him, "Senator Scott, why did you find it necessary to take a second trip down to the Panama Canal?" And Scott looked at me and said, "Because I found out that your ships go in both directions." And then I remember a letter that came to our office, and we had a constituent who was very upset that the communists had taken over Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho. And then there's the time when Bob Price had a bunch of cattlemen come to town. And I was the chief of staff, so I'm escorting them around the Capitol, and we're having nice memorabilia and chit-chats and stuff. I brought him into the Rayburn building where they said hello to the congressman because he was on the floor of the House on some bill. And after it was all over said and done, I bring him to the elevators. Now, here's a half a dozen, you know, rather substantial cattle people. And one of them had his father, I don't know how old he was, but he was clearly way up there. And he hadn't said a word. He just was walking around with them wherever they were going. So finally, I put them in the elevator, and just before the doors closed, the old man spoke up and he said, "You know what? You ain't no Texan, but by golly, you're the darndest nicest Yankee I ever did meet." So, and then there was Norty Hoffman, the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. Before he became Sergeant at Arms, he was the executive director of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and before that, he was a lobbyist for the steelworkers. And there was a bill that was going to come up in the committee that the steelworkers did not want. And he's talking with the chairman, and the chairman said, "Now, Norrie, don't you worry about that. That bill is not going to come up in the committee. And we'll see what happens." So, sure enough, the day of the hearing, the bill's going to be brought up. All of a sudden, the chairman started to get sweaty, and he was getting dizzy and stuff like that. And I'm like, I don't feel very good. And so he gavelled the hearing closed, and they literally almost carried him off, and he was lying down on the sofa in the back room where the members sort of just hung out before they come out into the committee. And Norty leaned over him and he said, "Mr. Chairman," he said, are you okay?" And the chairman said, "Now, Norty, I told you this bill's not going to come up in the committee." So, and then there's the time when there was a filibuster going on in the Senate. And Buddy Bell was one of our police officers who stood on the Senate floor. And he told me about this afterwards. So it's like midnight, and this is one of these all-nighter things. And he goes down into the little cafeteria on the main floor to get something to eat for a break. And this lady, this little lady that was in the cafeteria with one of these workers, she came up to him and she gave him an earful, and she used let's just say not pleasant language, describing Senator Robert Byrd for making this happen. He was the majority leader of the Senate. And Buddy said, now hold on. I don't know what her name was, we'll say Mabel. He said, hold on, Mabel. This is not Senator Byrd's doing. The people who are conducting the filibuster, the main one is Senator Averesk, and I forget what the other was. And so anyway, he's the one that is making you stay here at midnight. And she had already said, well, you can tell Senator Byrd to go blank himself. Mind is just talking to police officers at the cafeteria because she was so upset. And Buddy said, no, it's not him. Then she said, well, then you can go back up there and you tell Senator X to blank himself. And behind Buddy is standing the next person in line to get some food. And he said, I work for Senator Averesk. I will be happy to deliver your message. And I have to tell you, I actually had a real close brush with unnecessary, unwanted fame. There's a young lady by the name of Elizabeth Gray who stopped my boss on the floor of the house. Well, no, she's not on the floor, but just outside the door. She was looking for a job as a receptionist. She had worked for Congressman Ken Gray of Illinois, who was, and anyway, she had worked for him, but for whatever reason she wasn't. She was looking for a job. And she wanted to be a receptionist, that's what she had been. And to which my boss said, well, we're looking for, and it was true, we were looking for a receptionist, go and talk with Ron, blah, blah, blah. So she comes into the office, and she looked hard, she didn't look, and imagine representing a rural Texas district, having her sit at the front desk greeting the people. So I said, to myself, and all the other people in the office were like, so I'm interviewing her, and she said, well, I have the job, and I said, well, I'm sorry, I said, I'm in the process of having to talk with the congressman about what we're going to do. She said, well, he told me I could have the job just to go talk with you, and I said, well, he hasn't told me that, so I need to talk with him. But I said, I will call you in the morning. So she left. And I talked with him after that, and he said, I don't care what you do, just, I said, fine, because we already had somebody else picked out, and if you made me hire her, your whole staff will quit. So he said, I don't care. So I waited until the next morning, and I called her up, and I said, I am just getting back to you. I want to thank you for coming by yesterday, but I'm sorry, we've made a decision. We've been looking at somebody else, and we've decided to offer the job to that person. To which the stream of epithets came flying through the phone that almost melted the receiver. So I hung up. But that's not the story. The story is about 6 months later, maybe. This lady's picture is on the front page of the paper because she had been having an affair with Congressman Wayne Hayes, who was the chairman of the House Administration Committee. This was afterward, and she was quoted as saying, I don't know how to type. That could have been. One more little story on the long line of humor. Claude Pepper was a character from Florida. And we talked like that. And so anyway, my friend Kenny Black worked for Barry Goldwater Jr. The bells had rung for the members to come for a vote. So Kenny was with Barry as he was explaining something, bill or whatever. And the rule is when the members are being called, nobody uses the elevators till the members get to the floor. But if you're with a member, obviously you can. So anyway, Barry and Kenny get into the elevator, and all of a sudden, as the door's closing, there's a voice speaking up. Well, it's my good friend, young Barry. Barry, I'm so pleased to see you this afternoon. And Barry turns out, oh, hi, Claude, how are you? Well, I tell you, I have the privilege. I want you to meet my sister Mildred, who's here visiting me. And so he said, well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mildred. And she said, well, it's a pleasure to meet you, too. So, the piano. I was the unofficial pianist of Congress. I played at every party you could shake at. I played Happy Birthday to President Reagan. I played for the senators' private dinners when 6 senators retired. And I was, by the way, probably the only person that's ever been arrested for playing the Star-Spangled Banner on the 4th of July. We were down at the mall, friends of mine, and we were there for the fireworks. And then when the fireworks were done, we were going to leave. But they have a folk festival in the mall, and there was a platform with a piano on it. And so some of my friends said, Ron, play a couple tunes. So I went up there and I started playing. And then 2 police officers came along and said, folks, we all need to clear out here, go home. So I started to get up from the bench. And one of my friends said, well, hey, let's just finish up with the Star-Spangled Banner. And one police officer said, no, go ahead. So I started playing. Well, the other police officer didn't hear that. So he came up and put his hands on me and shoved me off the bench down on the floor. And I dropped up. And everybody's going crazy. So he arrested me. And my friends go with him to this big tent. And the cops, and they're like, okay, what did he do? So he said, you have an ID. And I handed him my congressional ID. And he looked and went, just a moment. He goes off someplace, and he comes back with a guy with scrambled eggs all over his head, with the head guy, the captain or whatever. And he says to me, now, look, we're very sorry about this, sir, and if you're willing to just drop the charges and not do anything, we'll be happy to do that. Now, if you want to press charges against officers, you can do that. And I'm looking at him like, I don't want to press any charges. I just want to go home. So off it went. But the Congress is a place where you have a lot of what I call pathos, the stories that you don't see in the paper. Like when Senator Hubert Humphrey was dying. He was flown back to Washington to give his farewell. He was down to just a matter of days. By the way, I flew out to Minnesota with the Sergeant Arms in Air Force One to go out and pick up the body and bring it back to Washington. That's another whole story. But the day he came to the Senate chamber, every senator was sitting at his or her desk. Unprecedented. They're in and out like ants. They were all sitting there. Hubert came in. I just happened to be standing on the floor because I had full privilege. I could go anywhere I wanted. And I was standing there kind of like this. And Hubert Humphrey very weakly came in, and all the senators stood up and started applauding. And they applauded, I'm not exaggerating, for 15 or 20 minutes without stopping, while he worked the crowd and he was shaking hands. And then he went over to the Republican side. And here's Barry Goldwater, who had been an opponent. But what maybe most people don't know was Barry Goldwater's hips were failing him, and he was in excruciating pain. And he's sitting at his desk. And Hubert came up toward him, and I'm watching Barry Goldwater doing this. And he's trying to get up. And he stood in front of Hubert Humphrey, and these 2 men embraced. And they hugged for 10 minutes. And the place went crazy. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Can you imagine seeing that today? But that was what Congress used to be and what Congress can be. So Congress is a mirror of the public. The hatred and the animosity today, it's in our society. It's a sickness. And those who are elected reflect the will of the people they represent. Religion in Congress. I don't mean to pretend to be the expert on this, but I suspect it's of special interest to our group. So I mentioned there are chaplains in the House and the Senate, and they are elected officers with full rights as an elected officer of the United States House or Senate. And not sure they could be created today with the secularism of our government. But they are inherently, traditionally, and legally established officers.
And they are the only officers that are elected without party affiliation. You probably heard recently that the House chaplain was supposedly fired. He's back on the job. A lot of flack about that. But they preside over every one of the sessions of the House and the Senate, and they give an invocation. They also are available to the members and the staff for counseling, and they occasionally attend major events where they provide opening prayers. And right here was the Senate Staff Club dinner, and I invited our chaplain, who was Dr. Elson, to give the invocation. He had, of course, been the senior pastor here at NPC. And you'll recall Barry Black, who was the chaplain of the Senate, has preached here at NPC as well. So I knew Dr. Elson. I got to know Chaplain Dick Halverson, and I don't need to tell you who he was. I also got to know Jim Ford, who was the chaplain of the House for a while, and he was from my home state of Minnesota. As far as my own activities, I attended Bible studies on campus and off. In fact, I went to a Bible study at the home of a fellow that worked for Senator Armstrong of Colorado, and the guy who invited me said, "You might be interested in coming because there's a young lady who is from your home state of Minnesota, and she works at the Supreme Court." I'm like, I better check this out. And the rest is history, as they say. But anyway, the bottom line is, my life on the Hill was like a fairy tale come true. There were amazing experiences. I've just touched on them. Amazing people that I met. Amazing beauty and pageantry for the love of our country. And most of all, the best possible experience anyone could ever hope for, being a brat on Capitol Hill. Thank you. I would like to just say two things. One, if you have not seen, there's just sort of some crazy memorabilia. It was fun digging through boxes to see what I had. And I included a few things for Wanda because otherwise I'd be beaten over the head when we got home. So there's some interesting things here. Plus, as a souvenir of the Commission of the Bicentennial of the Constitution, these are the actual pocket constitutions that were given to everybody by your congressmen, your senators, and stuff like that. So I brought along a package of them. If you'd like to have them, I'll just put them out here, and please help yourself. By the way, they're obsolete because the 27th Amendment has been added since that, which regulates the pay of Congress. It was actually part of the original 10 amendments. They didn't get passed back in the 1790s. It took a little while, but that's why this is technically not complete, but it was complete when it was printed in 1987. Anyway, thank you.
Great. I want to see you too, and thank you so much for coming and sharing with us wonderful stories, messages. We'll have a little time for questions here if you want to take some after. I just want to mention one thing about next week. An announcement for the speaker next week is Milton King, Reverend Milton King, who is one of ours. And he is going to be talking about his book called Think Moderates. So he argues that most Americans are really moderates, but they don't get in the paper and they don't have a visibility. So he's advocating this kind of moderation. And then at the end of the term and a last talk, we'll have another talk about how to deal with conflict. So that's the theme we're working on. And Ron, you kicked it off very nicely, set the tone, and I really appreciate your coming and sharing all this stuff with us. So thank you again, and we can all come up and take a look at his memorabilia here. Feel free to
I call it my rogues gallery.
Really
I don't know where we would put these.
Sure, we'll pass them
just
around.
pass on anybody. And if there are not enough, if people would like to have one, and there aren't enough for everybody, I can get some more. You just need to tell me or tell Paul or something like that, because I can just bring some in next Sunday. Anyway, if somebody would like to have a comment or a question, I'm happy to try it.
You actually elect chaplains, members?
Yes. All of the officers of each respective body are elected by the members. But the usual rule is for the other officers, it's the majority party picks the speaker, picks the majority leader, etc. The rule for the chaplain is it's not supposed to be partisan. Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned that electric is boring cheap here in Congress. So now we have a lot more technology coming to Congress, like a Facebook, Twitter, and we have a friend who's actually tweeting like it's full flight in the morning. So do you think all the technology will change the country positively or negatively? How do you see that?
Well, the question is about the impact of social media. If you look at what happens with social media, it's usually not very pleasant. Usually people say things to another person that they don't necessarily know, they would never say to that person face to face. So that, I think, increases what I call coarseness. The beauty of it is, of course, is that you have, any person has the world as their stage, and whether you like it or not, President Trump loves to tweet. And the nice thing is for him, the Washington Post can't filter what he says. They might try to, but they can. They can still run an article about him, or anybody can. But he can talk to everybody in this room directly, if he wants to, and if you want to hear what he has to say. So that, in a sense, is a good thing about social media. But there's obviously the dark side of it as well. Yes, sir. Vern?
Yeah. How did you learn to play the piano so well?
Well, I'm not sure I play it well. I have a sign on the wall in my house, in my family room. It was given to me by a friend years ago. And it's a replica of what they used to have in the old saloons in the Old West. And it says, please don't shoot the piano player. He's doing the best he can. And that's been my motto, and so far it's worked. But to answer your question, when I was 3 years old, I remember going to my mother's friend who lived next door. They had coffee with each other practically every day. And this neighbor lady had an old upright piano. And when I was 3, I would go running to the piano like a moth to the flame. I can't explain why. It was like a compulsion. And I'd climb up on the bench, I'd be doing this, and everybody's going like this, and they'd drag me off, and I'd go back, and they'd drag me off. So that's my first recollections of a piano. When I became 7, these people moved out of town. And when they moved out of town, they were not going to lug this piano with them, so my folks bought it for next to nothing. It took 6 burly guys to drag this thing over to our house. I tell people 5 of them got double hernias in the process. Hear stuff, and if I hear a melody, I can find it. And I started finding chords, and I started finding how the right hand and the left hand work together. And it's sort of just a self-taught thing. I guess that's the only way I can describe it. And people say, well, how do you do that? And I've thought about this so many times, and the only explanation I can give to people, and to you, is everybody in this room, with few exceptions, can sing a song. Everybody can hum a melody. You hear that. And you're able to reproduce that through your voice. I hear the melody, and I hear all of the chords here, and it comes up through my fingers. That's the only way I can explain it. I can't explain it anyway. But anyway, I've been doing it ever since.
Could you show the Tom magazine?
Well, for those of you who don't, everybody's heard about Forrest Gump. This is my Forrest Gump moment. I've been here for 1 week in Congress, in town, and I didn't know anybody. I didn't know where to go or what to do, but it was going to be Veterans Day, and so they were going to have a nice program down at the mall. You know, big entertainment. So I thought, wow, hey, this is good for me. I'll go to that. So I go to the mall, and I'm watching the entertainment, having a good time, minding my own business, and I saw photographers running around, and it was a big event. And anyway, the next Monday, the news magazines all came into our office, and I happened to see the Time magazine, and I said, oh wow, there's a Washington Monument, and I was just there a couple days ago, and then I looked down, there's me right front and center. So I brought this into the congressman, and I said, look at this. And he screamed, he yelled, Jim, his administrator said, get in here right away. And the poor guy jumped up and he ran in and he said, well, what's the matter, what's the matter? He said, will you look at this? Ron's been in town for 1 week and he's on the cover of Time magazine. I've been here for 24 years and I haven't been there. So that's
We better wrap it up at this point. Again, Ron, thank you so much.